So starting off the design phase, I normally try to make something that's firstly feasible within the time span that I have. I only have a week or two to make like 2 different tops, one for me and one for my partner. So I'm not looking for something that's really complex. Yet I want to try some new techniques or as a new design so as to challenge myself as a sewist. I spend 80% of my time on my iPad, so I'll be doing my design on it. And I just normally do it on Procreate because I paid money for it and I need to use it. Ever since I started making shirts for my partner, I've been using the same pattern, which is the tropical shirt by Wardrobe by Me, and I did alter the pattern slightly to make it fit better to my partner's dimensions. So I already have a set of paper patterns for the amended version. But this time I don't think I want to do a full folded collar thing. I think I'm just gonna go with a mandarin collar. I have made him a mandarin collar shirt before for Lunar New Year. It's a red coloured top, and of course being Chinese, I gotta go with that mandarin collar. And the Wardrobe by Me pattern has a interfaced button pen, and I don't think I want to do that this time. I did some googling just now and I found a tutorial for a fold over tailored shirt button band instead, and I think that's something I want to try. So it's basically like a sew on button band, which I think will at least make this shirt a little bit different because I've been doing the same one all these years. I might do 2 pockets instead of 1, and I want to do a shorter hem on the sleeves. So preferably maybe something that's the same width as the collar. This pattern also recommends a serge finish, which I've done for the rest of the shirts. But because I'm using a cotton linen blend fabric, I want to do a French seam and also to extend the lifespan of the shirt. So now moving on to my shirt. I found a photo of this top on Pinterest and I managed to find out who made it, and it's by this person called Finland Made on Instagram. And I really like the gathered cup like this, which I think could be not too difficult to make. I think it's basically a rectangle and with some double stitching here, and then the gathering is done by pulling the stitches, so it will end up looking like this. So as long as I make a piece of rectangle with this space being the part of my sternum by my chest that's not boobs, and gathering the part down, I think that will work. I'll probably be doing the ribbon ties just because the more ribbons the better to me. But this top is basically like a backless top which is laced at the back. But I want to close up the back, and also because the fabric that I'm using is different from theirs. They're probably using some sort of like stretchy fabric for this. I'm using a very stiff cotton linen. So I need to think of how to make this top a more complete one with like the back. So the bottom part of the shirt at the back would be basically open, but at least it has a sort of coverage there, not like my entire back is out. And I also can add like a lace-up element, which I really like because I love corsetry, and I think the extra ribbon at the back will be really cute. I think that's the design done. So this is my vision, and hopefully I'll be able to, show something for it. Hi, so I'm on the floor, and this is like the only place that I have that's big enough to accommodate like a big amount of fabric. So I end up just crawling on the floor a lot. You see me crawling around. I might do a time lapse, who knows? I might look like a creep, I don't know. And I'm trying my best to like hide the mess up here because it's really messy. I'm not the most tidy person and I have a lot of things, so please excuse this like really awkward angle. But this is the fabric that I have. It's the cotton linen blend that I got from a Spotlight a couple of months ago when they were having like some clearance sale. And I think I got like 2.5 meters of these for like $13. It's not the smoothest cotton linen ever, but it will do. And my partner really likes green. He's in his green phase. I don't know why. So when I saw this fabric, I'm like, oh, okay, great. More green for him to wear. He may hit the tone green, I don't know. And I keep all my patterns in this giant file. It's not the most organized, but at least the patterns are stored like in individual folders. And this is the Wardrobe by Me tropical shirt pattern that I have. The one that is in brown is the pattern pieces that I altered myself. For my top, I just need to make a couple of measurements, so mostly like my bust measurement, under bust measurement, as well as my waist. And I will need to measure this part of my chest that won't have any gathering so that I can make like a reference to how much gathering I want to do and how much of the length that I will need to make. and measure out for the top. I have this really big roll of butcher paper or brown paper that I bought off Shopee, and I use this primarily to do my pattern pieces. And I also use this to like stuff my vintage Coach bags to keep them in shape, and I also use them to wrap presents, so they're a great multitasker kind of item to have around the house, especially if you do a lot of crafting and sewing. When it comes to patterning my own clothes, I don't claim to be an expert. I tend to freeball it most of the time, or if I'm having trouble, I'll go look up a tutorial or a free pattern just to have a reference on what things should look like. And in the case for this top, I'm using the measurements from my bust, underbust, hips and waist to sort of come out with this pattern. For the bust portion of this top, I knew I wanted to do some gathering, so I just drew out a rectangle that was about 2 to 3 times my bust measurement. And for the body part of my top, I wanted to do it on the fold, so I just drew a curve based on my measurements. So this was the first mock-up for my patterns, and I'm just going to do some adjustments after I finish my partner's top. For my partner's top, I've already made several iterations of this pattern over the years, and I've already done my adjustments for them based on his measurements the second time round when I made them. So I'm mostly using the pattern that I already made, and you can see me crawling on my hands and knees because I do not have a cutting table. I really want to have a cutting table because my back is killing me when I do this. But anyways, the only parts that I'm gonna change for this shirt would be the button band. So those are the parts that I would have to redraft and cut out from scratch. And I am a serial scrap hoarder, so I'm using up the scraps of interfacing that I used for the previous shirts that I made for my partner. And I'd say that I really like this pattern by Wardrobe by Me for this tropical shirt because the instructions are really clear, and I really like that they give clear instructions on what parts you should prep first, so that the sewing later on goes very quickly and very smoothly. And after all that crawling and cutting on my hands and knees, I'm finally ready to start the project. And for this project, the thread that I'm using is from Gutterman. And I do like to match the composition of the thread to my fabric, so in this case I am using a cotton thread. So after I prepped the pocket, I'm pinning down the button band onto the front part of my shirt. And I'm also positioning the pocket onto the front as well. And I really like to take my time doing this because I like my pocket to be perpendicular and parallel in all the right places. This was actually my first time doing a folded button band, and I think I did have a little bit of a mix-up with the measurements that I did for this, but I made it work nonetheless. I think it did work out in the end, but if I were to do this again, I would definitely pay a lot more attention to the measurement and the folding part because it makes a really big difference in how the finished product will look. And I think my favourite part of making this top is always the sewing down of the pocket because that's when everything is really set in production. Moving on to the button band, I did follow this tutorial that was posted on the fabric store blog called The Thread by Rima Kusainova, which is really thorough in terms of how to draft the pattern for the button band and how to sew it down. The only issue I had with it was that my lines were not super straight because of my really awkward measurements, so really make sure the measurements are right before you sew everything down. Moving on to the body of the shirt, I'm placing the back placket onto the back of the shirt and pinning everything down. And I've done this method several times already, which is called the sandwich roll method, that is really concisely thought on the tutorial and the instructions from Wardrobe by Me for this tropical shirt. And honestly, making this tropical shirt from Wardrobe by Me has taught me many techniques that I wouldn't have known otherwise. So even though I don't really like buying patterns, I do really see the point in it, especially when they're as clear and concise as this one. And I really love this sandwich method for attaching the front and backs of shirts together because it gives a really nice and clean finish. Apart from sewing in the pocket, I also really love the stay stitching or the decorative stitching that is done for this placket piece because again, it sort of signifies the midpoint of the project, and I love the extra detail that it gives to the shirt. Now it's time for me to draft the pattern for the collar, and I'm measuring out the length of the collar part. And for the Mandarin collar, I am using another tutorial by Rima Kusainova from the Thread blog to draft the pattern for this collar. And this involves making notches in a rectangular piece of drafting paper that is of the length of the collar part of your shirt and curving it such that when you sew it onto the shirt, it lays flat. And after I was happy with the pattern, I then cut it out of the fabric that I have. I did mess up the first time because I think I did the notches at the wrong intervals, but I did correct it, and now I'm cutting out the interfacing that's needed as well and ironing it on. For the collar, I am attaching it as in the instructions for the wardrobe by me pattern, but the method is really similar to that of the matching collar tutorials, so you can just follow that if you don't have the wardrobe by me pattern. So after sewing the 2 pieces of the fabric that's needed for the collar together, I cut in notches for the curves and trim down the seam allowance. For my collars, I know that I should be ironing them down, but I tend to use my nails to press the fabric together and then do a stitch near the edge of the collar to make everything nice and crisp. And somehow I skipped the entirety of me putting the collar in because I'm pretty sure I was frustrated and it was really late, so I didn't want to bother filming it down. And now that the collar is in, I'm just hemming the entirety of the bottom of the shirt. I do fold down and take the shirt to the ironing board so that when I do my hemming, the past test doesn't fly everywhere. Oh, and I did forget to mention that I used a French seam sewing method for this shirt because I didn't want to deal with a serger because it was a linen material, and I did want to also play around with elevating the sewing techniques that I use for this top, because after making this top year after year, I do need a different set of challenges to make sewing this top a little bit more interesting. And I did have to find a tutorial on how to hem the cut off parts of the side of the shirt so that I don't mess up the French seams of the side seams. Honestly, the sleeves of any project is one of the most annoying things to deal with, and I don't really like sewing sleeves in. It's not that it's particularly difficult, but just that it can be a little finicky in terms of how the shirt is finished because there's so many different seam lines to pay attention to, and sometimes I'm just not that bothered to make everything line up. But because this is a gift for my partner, I always put in a little bit more effort to make sure that things look at least presentable. And I'm not ashamed to say it, but I do still mess up sometimes when I do set in sleeves. But I think finishing most of the sleeve before I set everything in does make the process go a little bit smoother just because I can see the finished product. And again, this pattern is really helpful because they do have notches where you should be lining up the sleeves, so pinning them in isn't much of a problem most of the time. The problem comes when I sew it in, because this time I decided to do French seams and I did set in the sleeves normally as I would if I was doing serge edges, but I realized, oh, I do need to turn things inside out and do things the other way around, so I did have to remove the sleeves and put it back on. But somehow I did it, and this is the almost finished shirt. I think it's looking really nice and really clean. And the last part is just to add in the buttons, and I'm really lucky that my Janame sewing machine has a buttonhole maker, so I never have to hand sew any buttonholes. But somehow after 4 years of owning this sewing machine, I realized that I have to increase the tension for the stitches so that I get a nice and clean buttonhole that is not loose. But having this buttonhole attachment makes my life so much easier, and it makes making buttonholes really fun because it's really clean looking and it also signifies the end of the project. So I'm really happy when I do have to use the buttonhole attachment, even though it's only for this top most of the time. And look at it, it's so pretty. And I just use my seam ripper to rip open the buttonholes. I do a little snip of the fabric first with my scissors, and then I shove my seam ripper in it. And I'm just really careful with this part because I'm really scared that I'll rip the entire buttonhole open, so it's really important to control your strength when you do this. And for this shirt, I didn't really have the chance to go and buy some new buttons, so I just used some dark shell buttons that I have from the previous projects that I had, which I think suited the color scheme for this shirt. And I just hand sew them on using needle and thread like the olden days. And you might think that I wouldn't like sewing buttonholes because it is a little bit finicky, but I actually do enjoy hand sewing because I sort of fell into the historical fashion rabbit hole and became a really avid watcher of many historical costumers on YouTube. And I even made an entire linen top by hand sewing, and I thought that was really fun, so I really love hand sewing. And I also got my start into sewing again because of embroidery. So whenever I have the chance to do a little bit of hand sewing in the project, I really enjoy it because it not only looks a lot cleaner and more professional, I do think it gives a lot more durability to the project and also a bit more personality because my stitches aren't perfect, and it shows that, a human made it instead of a machine, which I really like, and I think that's the point of sewing clothes for other people. And this shirt is finally done. I'm so happy to be done with this because I can finally move on to my own top and I won't have to be naked. I did prioritize my partner shirt first, so now that I'm done with that, I just sewed up my mocha for the top part of my shirt. So basically from the rectangle, I gathered up the portions that I marked out for the bust, under bust gathering. And then I just place it on my chest. And because the gathering was done, there was quite a lot of gaping over here. So what I did is just pin down the areas of my top so that the top part is flushed against my chest. It's looking quite good for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unravel this gathering, see how the overall fabric looks like with all the darts already pinned down. So basically now, this is what my top pattern is looking like. It's more like a curved shape, it's rectangular. So what I'm going to do is just to smooth out this point over here because of the triangular dart, I'm going to smooth it down right here. I'm just going to cut it off. So this is my new updated pattern, and I just need to mark out the areas that I need to gather. And please do not ask me what the exact measurements are because it's anyhow. I did it anyhow, okay? And my bust is small, so there's not much gathering to do. But anyways, I cut out my pattern again on my mock-up fabric and made a second mock-up. I've attached the top part to the bottom mock-up. This is what it's looking like so far. After fussing around this a lot, I decided to shorten the top. This again will be the pre-seam allowance length. And I also brought up my waist upwards by about a centimeter because it was a bit too low before, and then that's what was causing a lot of the creasing. I ended up drafting more pattern pieces for the back here instead, which is pretty simple, it's just like a trapezoid. And I used the same base pattern for the front part, for the back portion, and there's a little bit of gaping right here, which I don't really mind because I think I would want my lacing to end just at my waist so that I can get that really cinched in effect. So the bottom part here anyways would be free. So I think honestly this is pretty good because I do like that V-shape effect that it gives. But due to that gaping, I do think that I will need to bring the hip measurement out a little bit because you can tell that it's slanting more towards my front and I want it to lay more in the middle. So I think I'll probably add like a centimeter to each side. So basically what I'm going to do now is just cut out my actual fabric, which I don't have a lot of because I kept messing up my partner's mandarin collar and I had to do it like 3 times, so I wasted quite a bit of fabric doing that. But I don't think that this will take a lot of fabric, so I think it'll be fine. So these are the pattern pieces I ended up with: the bust, the back, and the bottom part. And I didn't have much of my linen fabric left after I was done with my partner's shirt, but that is why I always do itty bitty camisoles for myself when I do these kind of like matchy outfits for my partner and I, because it saves on the amount of fabric that I do have to get, and I'm able to adjust how itty bitty my tops are based on the amount of fabric that I have left from my partner's shirt. But this time I surprisingly had quite a lot of fabric left because my top was really itty bitty, so if I were to mess up any part of it or were to remake any part, I did have some fabric left in case. I also cut out several strips of fabric for the back lacing as well as the ties for the shoulders. And this top was actually pretty straightforward to make because it only had a few pattern pieces. But tell me why I almost crashed the hell out when I made this. Let's wait and find out. So for this top, I started off by sewing down the gathering stitches that I needed for the bust. And I always like to do 2 parallel gathering stitches. I know that there's a method to increase the tension for the stitches when you do this, but I do like to control how much gathering is done and how regular they are. And I really take my time to make sure that the length of the gathering is correct before I tie off the ends because I don't want my gathers to loosen while I'm sewing down the top to the bottom part. And I also cut out another piece of fabric for the lining of the bust, so I repeated it on the second one before moving on to sewing down the little strips of fabric that I wanted to turn inside out for the ties. But this was one of the first parts of this top that made me crash out because I hate turning ties inside out, and I had 5 or 6 of them to turn inside out, and I was losing it because it took so much time. But you know what, I just like how ties look. I think it's really cute, and I like the little ribbon details of the shoulder ties when I do this, so I just had to suck it up and do it. And after like 2 hours, I was free from my shackles of the ties. Moving on, I sewed down the 2 side seams of the bottom part of the top together using French seams, which made my life easier and harder at the same time. And then I'm sewing down the back panels to the gathered bust portion of the top, and I'm doing it twice because there are 2 layers to this. And then I'm sandwiching the top layer of the top with the bottom, so that when I flip it right side up, the raw edges would be hidden within. So it's really important for me to line everything up properly so that the gathered part of the front and the lining layer would be properly aligned. Then I'm finally adding my shoulder ties to the pre-measured parts of my top, and I'm sewing it down onto 1 layer first before doing the sandwich method that I learned in the tropical shirt. So I'm rolling up the bottom layer of the top, sandwiching it between the 2 top layers and pinning everything down so that my ties and the top layer of my top is all encased within that little tube that we made. And again, this method isn't something I would come up by myself. I would have done another method where I probably would have like ironed down the hems of the very tops of the bust portion and then sewed a stitch running through all of it. But this method again gives a really clean finish to the top while encasing my ties and all the raw edges within it. And then I'm just hemming the side panels of the back part of my top. Now using one of the ties that I made, I'm cutting little strips of fabric about 2 inches long to make the little fabric loops that I'm going to be using for my corset lace-up bag. For the top part of this top, I am inserting the loops in between the fabric tube, and I made sure that everything was placed in regular intervals before stitching it down by hand, before going in with my sewing machine and securing the loops down onto the fabric. And to finish off the little fabric loops, I just folded the fabric onto itself, and I used a whip stitch to just close it off and again hide all the little frayed ends inside it. And doing so really gives a nice clean finish to the back of the top. It honestly didn't end up mattering, and you'll see why. And jumping back to the top portion of this top, I'm doing a running stitch near the edge of the top so that everything stays in place and gives a nice clean finish again. And for the ties, I'm just folding the raw edges in and sewing it down by hand. And from the front, the top looks amazing, but from the back, there's a lot of bunching from the corset lace up, and that's because there isn't enough support back there, so I ended up having to add in boning. And I only had this kind of plastic boning where I had to insert into casing. So I made some casings, put in the boning by hand, and this is what it looks like. And you can tell that it was a hard time because I did not film any of it. And that's because I had to attach the casing in by hand, sewing it down, and I had to hand sew in little squares of fabric at the top at the bottom of the casing so that the bones don't poke out. But at least I was done with that, and I could finally move on to the most fun part of this top, which is decorating. I got this strip of cotton lace from AliExpress a while back, so I decided to use it to decorate the top of my top. And I thought that it would give a nice little callback to the 1800s corsets, where you often had some decorative lace at the tops and bottom of it. And I pinned it down to the top, and I made sure that the scallops were at least of equal intervals so that the middle part is properly aligned and the back portions look fairly symmetrical and even. And I'm just hand sewing it down onto my top. So I just folded in the edges of the cotton lace at the back, and I just did a couple of simple whip stitches along the edge to attach it to the back part before doing tiny little running stitches that sort of corresponded with the little eyelets on the lace so that the stitches would not look obvious at all. And again, this took a little bit of time, but I did enjoy doing this because it was kind of therapeutic just deciding where the stitches should start and end. And with all the chaos that I experienced with the turning in of the ties and the bunching of the back, this was a much needed respite to all of that. And look at how clean the finish of it is. I think that little bit of hand sewing is really worth it. I also got this vintage ribbon rosette from Japan when I was there, I think about 1 or 2 years ago. I've been trying to find a reason to use them because I just got them on impulse, to be honest. But I think that the shades of blues and purples in this flower really matched the colour of the fabric really well. And I'm finally done with these tops. I honestly did not take much time to do this because I always give myself an insanely tight timeline to make them. But despite how little time I have making them, I think it looks great on both of us. I actually really do love matching outfits, but I just don't like how corny the commercial ones are. So I'm really glad that I have the ability to make some articles of clothing that would both suit our personalities and styles. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I'll see you in my next one.